Picture the busiest Canada you can remember. Full malls, humming highways. Now count the green awnings. For about 20 years, you couldn't drive far in this country without passing one. That wasn't an accident. It was the visible edge of something enormous. At its peak, this sandwich chain was the largest restaurant brand on Earth, not by sales, by sheer number of stores. It had more outlets than McDonald's, more than Starbucks. At full speed, it opened a new shop somewhere on the planet every few hours. Today, that same brand is thinning out across our streets, faster than almost any chain in the country. And it happens so quietly that most people never clock the dark unit in their own plaza until the sign changes to a nail salon. This is how the biggest sandwich empire ever built slipped in reverse, and why our country is where that reverse shows up first. Treat it as a business autopsy, a straight answer to a question almost nobody asks. How is a chain this broken still setting profit records while its own stores go dark one plaza at a time? Because here's the twist, and we'll come back to it at the end. The two men who built all of this are dead, and every Canadian storefront that closes now makes one Wall Street firm richer, not poorer. That is not a coincidence. It's the design. To understand any of it, we have to rewind almost 60 years to a loan of $1,000 and a kid who never planned to sell sandwiches at all. The year is 1965. A 17-year-old named Fred DeLuca is hunting for a way to pay for medical school. A family friend, a nuclear physicist named Peter Buck, offers him $1,000 and a suggestion: open a submarine sandwich shop. That first store nearly went under. They even bungled the name. It opened as Pete's Supermarines, but on a local radio ad, the words slurred into Pizza Marines. So they scrapped it, and by 1968, landed on something shorter and stickier: Subway. They were slow learners in a slow business. A decade in, they had only a few dozen locations to show for it. But somewhere in those thin years, the two men found something worth far more than a recipe. It is the hinge of this entire story. Opening their own shops was slow and costly. Selling other people the right to open shops and skimming a slice of those people's sales forever was almost limitless. So Subway drifted out of the sandwich trade and into a stranger one. It became a factory for producing franchise owners, and it made itself the cheapest franchise in the entire market. Look at what a burger franchise demanded back then. A standalone building, fryers, ventilation, well over $1 million to get the doors open. A Subway asked for a cold table, a slicing station, and an oven for the loaves. That was close to the whole list, a fraction of the burger price. Suddenly, be your own boss was within reach of ordinary people, and they lined up around the block to sign. Many were first-time owners, new arrivals, families betting their savings on a name they already trusted. That trust was the fuel. The easier it was to get in, the more people got in, and the more operators there were to take a cut from. Even better, the tiny footprint slid into places no rival could ever fit. A gas station, a food court, a hospital concourse, a dead corner of a big box store. Then it caught a wave and rode it for 2 decades. Through the low-fat, calorie-counting years, Subway sold reassurance more than flavor. The lunch you didn't have to feel guilty about, in an era when nothing else at the counter even pretended to be good for you. It sold control, too. Build your own, exactly your way, while McDonald's handed everyone the same burger. Cheap to open, easy to feel virtuous buying, endlessly customizable. That mix didn't grow the company, it launched it. By 2002, Subway had passed McDonald's in store count. By the early 2010s, it was running past 40,000 outlets worldwide, opening one every few hours. No restaurant company in history had ever stretched that far, and nowhere took to it faster, for its size, than Canada. At the peak, Subway sat among the most numerous restaurants in the whole country, more than 3,000 of them. 1,132 in Ontario alone, close to 38% of the entire country's stores packed into a single province. For a generation of Canadians, especially in places too small to support a proper restaurant row, that awning wasn't a decision, it was part of the furniture. That was the rise, and from the outside, it looked bulletproof. But hidden inside every ingredient of it, the rock-bottom cost, the reckless speed, the reflex to grow no matter what, was the exact thing that would take it apart. The decision that broke the model didn't come down from headquarters. it bubbled up in 2004 from a single frustrated owner. His name was Stuart Frankel. He ran a pair of Subways tucked inside a Miami hospital, and his weekends were dead quiet. So he reached for the bluntest lever he had. One flat price, $5. Any footlong, no exceptions. The weekend crowds came straight back, and, crucially, he wasn't losing money to pull them in. Head office shrugged for 3 years. Then a handful of other owners copied it. A few watched sales rocket by a quarter or more. And in 2007, corporate turned it into a nationwide campaign. It detonated. That $5 jingle wormed into the whole continent's memory. Put a number on it. In 1 year, that single promotion piled on billions in extra sales. By some counts, close to the size of an entire Domino's conjured out of nothing. For a company already hooked on growth, it was the perfect drug. And nobody at the top stopped to ask what it was quietly doing to the people actually making the sandwiches. Because a deal that loud does something permanent. It teaches your customer what your food is worth and never lets them forget. A whole generation was trained that a foot of Subway equaled a single $5 bill. That figure set like concrete. And the company could never break back out of it. Everything underneath the number kept climbing. Flour, meat, produce, wages, rent, while the number itself refused to move. Eventually, one franchisee did the math out loud, in public. So take a single $5 sale and watch the subtractions. Bread, meat, cheese, produce, the paper wrap. By his tally, more than $4 just to build the sandwich. That leaves under $1 for rent, for hydro, for the wage of the person who made it. And before any of those get paid, corporate lifts its share off the very top. On that $5 sub, roughly 62 cents. Run the subtraction, and the owner isn't earning a thin margin. On a lot of stores, they were paying for the privilege of making your lunch. Corporate finally scrapped the promotion around 2018, then panicked and dragged it back a year later, by which point inflation had made it a guaranteed loser. A quick fix for one slow Miami weekend had become the arithmetic that made the whole system impossible to survive. To understand how thousands of owners could all be selling at a loss at once, you have to see where Subway truly earns. It is not from feeding you. Its money comes off the top of the sale, a fixed share of everything a store rings up, taken ahead of rent, ahead of ingredients, ahead of a single hour of wages. Reckon the core royalty at roughly 8 cents on the dollar, add a marketing levy of about 4.5 more. Together, close to 1/8 of the store's entire revenue is spoken for before the owner has covered one real cost. Across a year, for an average shop, that's tens of thousands of dollars, often north of 40 grand, flowing upward whether the store thrived or drowned. That single gap is the engine of the collapse. The parent company wins the moment a store sells something. The owner only survives if a store keeps something. While the two move together, everyone eats. The instant they split apart, and the $5 ceiling made sure they would, only one side is shielded. It is never the family that put a second mortgage on the house to buy in. And it ran deeper than the royalty. Subway also collected a fee every time it signed a brand new owner, so its instinct never wavered. More doors, always more doors. Picture the result at street level. 2 Subways staring at each other across the same intersection. To the 2 owners, that's a slow catastrophe. The same lunch crowd cut in half, the same rent due on both. To head office, it barely registers, because the royalty lands on the combined total either way. Multiply that by thousands of corners, and notice the box the owner is now trapped in. Sell more, and you owe more off the top. Sell less, and the fixed costs eat you alive. Raise your prices, and the $5 generation walks out the door. The contract they signed to buy their freedom had become the one thing they could never get out of. None of this was hidden either. For decades, Subway's franchise system carried a reputation as one of the harshest in the industry. Its operators tangled in disputes and lawsuits at many times the rate seen at other big chains. And the dream was often sold hardest to first-time owners with everything riding on it. In Canada, the squeeze wore the usual face. Thinner staff, longer lines, managers counting slices of meat and cheese to claw back a few cents in order. And to keep the tills moving at all, Corporate pushed even harder on the very discounts its owners were already bleeding on. So the machine did more than crush the operator. It forced the operator to shortchange the customer, who tasted the difference and started looking elsewhere. When the math breaks like that, the food is the first to go, and then the story around the food. Because the one claim the brand was built on, that it was the healthy pick, was coming apart in public. It arrived as a run of headlines, each uglier than the last. It started with the bread. In 2014, a food blogger spotted an industrial additive on Subway's ingredient label, a compound also used to make the foam in yoga mats and shoe soles. Her petition drew tens of thousands of signatures in days. Subway phased the chemical out within weeks, but something had shifted for good. The smell people once called fresh baking now came stapled to a chemistry lesson. Then came the bread ruling. In 2020, Ireland's highest court studied the recipe and found it carried so much sugar it could not legally be sold as bread. By the letter of that law, it belonged with pastries. And on this side of the ocean, this stopped being a food review and became something closer to a forensics report. A CBC team had the chicken DNA tested at a wildlife lab, the kind that normally tells you which animal a bone came from. The result? On the oven-roasted chicken, 53.6% chicken DNA. The chicken strips were worse, 42.8%. The main filler was soy, and the entire health story had leaned on one man, a spokesman famous for a single feat, shedding an enormous amount of weight eating only Subway. In 2015, he was arrested and admitted to monstrous crimes against children. In a single afternoon, the human face of the brand became something the company had to strip from every wall. You can repaint a billboard overnight. You cannot untell a story you spent 15 years pressing onto a whole country. Into that vacuum walked competitors selling the exact thing Subway had thrown away. Jersey Mike's, teamed with a Canadian operator, is now rolling out 300 outlets nationwide, and it's planting the first of them in Ontario, Subway's own stronghold, on one simple promise. The meat is carved in front of you. A&W had already shown years before that the opposite bet pays off in this market. It leaned into better beef raised without hormones, and its numbers went up, not down. Subway, meanwhile, was being hit from both sides at once. From below, dollar menu giants that were simply cheaper. From above, fresh casual chains that were simply better. It had spent 20 years parked comfortably in the middle, and the middle was the first thing to vanish. But here is the hinge of the whole story, the part almost everyone gets backwards. Those scandals explained why customers stopped coming in. They do not, on their own, explain why the doors are being locked. A solid business rides out a bad news cycle and keeps moving. What turned these blows fatal was the structure beneath them. The operators were already worn to the bone, with nothing held in reserve for a slow month, let alone a real drop in foot traffic. Which carries us back to the twist. For nearly 60 years, Subway had never once been sold. It stayed private, held by the two men who dreamed it up. Then, one after the other, they were gone. DeLuca was diagnosed with leukemia in 2013 and died 2 years later. He left his half of the company to his wife, Elizabeth. Buck hung on until 2021, and when he died, he left his half not to an heir, but to his own charitable foundation. By then, that stake was worth close to $5 billion. That split is what finally forced a sale. A foundation cannot run a global sandwich empire. It needs its half turned into money it can give away. So in 2024, for the first time in its life, Subway changed hands. The buyer was a buyout shop named Roark Capital. The price landed around $9.5 billion, a little short of the $10 billion the families had wanted. Sit with the arc for 1 second. A $1,000 loan to a teenager in 1965. A $9.5 billion exit for a private equity firm in 2024. That is the whole rise and fall in 2 numbers. And it helps to stop picturing a lunch counter and start picturing what Roark was actually buying, not the bread. A dependable river of royalty payments that arrives every month ahead of any store's bills. Roark already sat on a shelf of familiar names: Arby's, Dunkin' Donuts, Baskin-Robbins, Auntie Anne's. Subway was simply one more royalty stream to bolt onto the collection. This is the playbook. Firms like Roark gather up tired, familiar brands, run them for cash instead of growth, and let the financing do the rest. The sandwich shop your kid's team piled into after a game is now a line on a spreadsheet, valued not by how good the food is, but by how reliably the check clears. Here is the cold math of what Subway has become. A takeover that size runs mostly on borrowed money, and that debt gets stacked onto the company being purchased. Billions of it now sit on Subway's own books. Paying it off doesn't require a single thriving restaurant. It only requires the royalty checks to keep landing, which is why the figures look upside down from outside. As the store count falls, the parent company's reported profit has been climbing. Even as the money collected from franchisees actually shrank, fewer shops, weaker owners, a bigger bottom line. The empire two founders spent their entire lives assembling has been quietly repurposed into something they never designed, a machine for lifting cash up and pressing risk down. So where does the fall go from here? The clearest preview sits just below the border, because the American curve runs roughly 12 months in front of our own. Down there, Subway now shuts far more stores than it opens. Year after year, it has dropped beneath 19,000 locations, a floor the chain hadn't touched in about 20 years. Read that as the warning light on the dashboard. Canada is a short distance back on the very same road, and the shape of this country makes the landing rougher. Our stores are strung thin across an enormous map. That heavy Ontario cluster sits precisely where the pressure will bite deepest, and we have far fewer dense downtown cores to cushion a wave of closures. When a Subway goes dark in a small Canadian town, nothing rushes in to replace it. In a city, an empty unit is released within a month. On a rural main street, it simply stays dark. One more boarded window in a place already fighting to keep its lights on. The closures won't land evenly. They'll land hardest exactly where that green awning once mattered most. And that is the whole lesson of this rise and fall. Subway swallowed the world and this country by marketing a dream, a business anyone could afford to open, a menu anyone could feel good ordering, a bet that supposedly could never lose. Every one of those turned out to be the snare. Cheap to open produced far too many stores. Easy to feel good about meant the steepest fall of all, when the good feeling curdled, and could never lose now lives on a spreadsheet that profits precisely by squeezing more out of fewer, weaker shops. So here's something to carry out of this. Next time you pass a Subway that's just had the fresh forward makeover, the glowing digital boards, the meat slicer set in the window, don't read it as a comeback. Read it as the last squeeze. It's an upgrade the struggling owner was usually made to pay for, out of their own pocket, on a contract that never changed. A fresh coat of paint doesn't lower the royalty. It doesn't rebuild the trust the headlines burned down. Every dark window on a Canadian main street is more than a closed sandwich store. It's a broken lease, a kid sent home without a shift, and a stream of royalties still climbing to owners whose names those customers will never learn. So I'll hand it to you. When you pass a Subway now, do you even see it anymore? Or is it faded into the background like a payphone you walk by without a glance? Be honest about the last time you actually chose one on purpose. And if there's a Canadian sandwich counter you genuinely want back, a hometown sub shop, a chain that quietly slipped away, a loaf they retired that you'd order tomorrow, put its name in the comments. I want to see which ones we still miss. Because this was never really about lunch. It's about who ends up holding the places we grew up inside. And there's another Canadian name, one we all assumed was permanent, waiting to have its own rise and fall pulled apart next. Until then, stay sharp.